Dr. Steph. We have Dr. Stephanie Powell with us today, and she's an expert in sexual exploitation, labor trafficking, sex trafficking, and child abuse. She served as a sergeant in charge of a vice unit at the Los Angeles Police Department for 30 years. And after retiring, she led the Journey Out, a nonprofit that assists victims of human trafficking. And under her leadership, Journey Out grew in size and scope, and today it serves more than 360 people per year as they take steps to their freedom. Dr. Powell also served as the Vice President and Director of Law Enforcement Training and Survivor Services at the National Center of Sexual Exploitation, and she has educated over 12,000 law enforcement officials, prosecutors, first responders, and community leaders nationwide. She is an adjunct assistant professor of behavioral science at Los Angeles Trade Technical College and an adjunct professor at the University of Southern California. She has recently written a workbook for teenagers on human trafficking titled My Choice, My Body, My Rules. The workbook is available on Amazon and is being used on both national and international levels. She is the contributing author of the textbook Girl Trafficking Misunderstood: Understanding the Commercially Sexually Exploitation of African American Girls, available through the Cohen Press and Amazon. Dr. Powell is a powerful and in-demand speaker and a recognized expert on human trafficking in all forms. And without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Stephanie Powell.
Hello, everyone. I guess I should say good morning to some, good afternoon to others. Thank you for joining us today. And we're going to talk about when human trafficking becomes fatal. Oftentimes, unfortunately, when victims of human trafficking are have been killed, of course, the cause of death, it never talks about the human trafficking portion of it, and we're going to talk about why. And we're also going to see the interconnection of domestic violence as it pertains to human trafficking as well. So as you can see that this presentation is supported by the grant, and of course, the opinions and findings and conclusions are more related to me as opposed to the Department of Justice. So we're going to explore the connection between intimate partner violence. We are going to also discuss how domestic violence victims can also be trafficked. Also, how trafficking can become fatal. I know that is well, how should I say? I know for some of you, this is extremely clear. Probably for all of you, this is clear. So some of these things are not going to be things that you just did not know before, but what it is going to do is probably remind you and go like, oh, okay, that's right. And this also, I hope at the end of this, is going to, I know for me, even as I was preparing this, I was thinking how important it is for us to cross-pollinate as it pertains to training. You know, in other words, I was talking to Letitia about this. I was like, you know, I know about domestic violence, but that's not my expertise. My expertise is human trafficking. But when you see how there's an intersection of both, it just reminded me of the importance of how I need to know even more about domestic violence and working with those victims, as well as my knowledge of human trafficking, and then vice versa. I know for those that are experts in domestic violence that may not be experts in human trafficking, but having the knowledge of both sides, all it does is just helps us to be able to serve our clients better. We're also going to discuss in this presentation solutions to combat human trafficking and explore considerations for DVFRTs as well as advocates. So if you have any questions, Letitia will be monitoring the chat, and so will I. So if you could just place your questions there. Once I finish this presentation, then we will go to the question and answer. Well, Letitia, you're still there. Do you want them to put it in Q&A or in the chat?
Yes, I would prefer the chat. I did receive a message saying that the chat was disabled, but I did resolve that issue. So could someone please utilize the chat to let me know if that's working?
So see, she's the boss, so
Awesome.
she knows exactly what to do.
Yes, it looked like it's working. Thank you
Okay.
all.
Outstanding. So just for the clarification of this particular presentation, I'm just going to go over the definitions really quickly. When we talk about human trafficking, of course, it's the use of force, fraud, or coercion to obtain some kind of labor, including commercial sex acts. So in this particular presentation, we'll be touching more on sex trafficking as opposed to labor, but just know that labor and sex trafficking can also intersect as well. Also, when we talk about the definition of human trafficking, just one thing to remember, when you are talking about minors under the age of 18, if they are involved in commercial sex acts, and we're talking about prostitution here, just by their age alone, they are considered to be victims of human trafficking. When it's an adult and something like this goes to court, that's where you have to prove the force, fraud, or coercion aspect of it. You don't have to do that with minors. It's by their age alone that they're already considered to be human trafficking victims. The other thing that I really want to point out is just a reminder that when we talk about prostitution, of course, we know that there are those that have made those choices, but sometimes it's a choice when they don't have any other choice. And so not everyone in prostitution is a victim of human trafficking, but all human trafficking victims are involved in prostitution. So I just wanted to remind us of that. When we talk about IPV, intimate partner violence, it's a type of domestic violence perpetuated by someone who is or wants to be in an intimate relationship with another person. And then, of course, domestic violence is a pattern of emotional, physical, sexual, psychological, or economic abuse perpetrated by one household member against another. So let's talk about who the traffickers are. Traffickers, the word trafficker and pimp, you will hear me use those interchangeably. They really are one in the same. So pimps or traffickers could be family members, gang members, crime syndicates. Here in Los Angeles, and that's where I live, we find that a lot of the pimps are gang members, and we see that in other places. But in other places, we see that some of the pimps are not gang members. But what is true across the United States is that when we talk about familial trafficking, where it's family members, where it's the mom who might be pimping out her daughter because of poverty or because of drugs. Individuals can be victims of pimp-controlled, transgender-controlled, family-controlled, gang-controlled, or crime syndicate controlled trafficking. What I found here in LA, sometimes when we go into the strip clubs, we would see that the Russian crime syndicate would be the ones that would be running the strip clubs. So traffickers are often intimate partners, and we're going to talk about that definition of partners later. It's not uncommon for a victim's romantic partner, spouse, or casual lover to be their trafficker. So yes, I have found, unfortunately, in cases where it was the husband that was pimping out the wife. In fact, romantic interest or sexual attraction is usually a tool that traffickers will use to manipulate their victims, unfortunately. So, who are the common trafficking victims? So, from January 20th from January 2020 through August 2022, 44% of sex trafficking victims were trafficked by a member of their own family, and 39% were trafficked by an intimate partner. According to a 2019 report by Polaris Project, leveraging intimate partner marriage propositions and familial bonds are by far the most common recruitment tactic. So as you could see, these are ways that they will get them involved, and it's also ways that they will keep them involved. According to Polaris, the fact is Black women and girls are most vulnerable to sex trafficking than any other race, with 40% of all victims and survivors of sex trafficking found to be Black in a 2-year study of the U.S. Department of Justice. So even though it is that high as it pertains to African American girls and women, we also know that this really has no boundaries when we're talking about race or we're talking about class as well, or economic status. One study found that the racial and ethnic minorities have more than twice the odds of being trafficked as minors. So, as we're looking at this, it's really common that we really understand the ethnic part of it. And the other part that is really important to understand is that there's this myth that the victims are kidnapped into trafficking. That only makes about 1%. You know, we've always heard about the white van with no windows that are snatching people. But what we're finding is more often than not, victims of human trafficking actually know their trafficker. So we will see this myth sometimes displayed in movies. Again, it really creates a wrong narrative of what is really happening in real life, and the fact that traffickers or family members are intimate partners. Traffickers also take advantage of addiction. They target oppressed or marginalized people. They target youth with emotional vulnerabilities, and these factors contribute to this increased vulnerability of sex trafficking. And so when we compare that to the racial counterparts, Black women and girls suffer high rates of these combined factors. So I'm sure as you see this, you're starting to see, if we were putting together a quilt, you could see how this quilt, these patches of domestic violence and victims of human trafficking, you're starting to see how they are unfortunately interconnecting. It is important to recognize that there is this marked overlap that I just spoke of as it pertains to human trafficking and domestic violence. So here you have this victim that could be one and the same because they don't occur in silos. So this pattern of behavior is identical. Both abusers and traffickers use power and control over their victims. So this inherent link between domestic violence and human trafficking, because of these dynamics, really these dynamics that are being used to establish a main power and control are so similar. And the grooming methods that traffickers use to get their victims really does mimic partner relationships. And so again, as you are seeing this, those of you that are my experts on DV, you're starting to see that same person and being able to understand that this could be one and the same. Alternately, also what happens is that trafficked individuals oftentimes live with the traffickers and are subjected to physical abuse, emotional manipulation, overbearing control, which are also hallmarks of domestic violence. And also what you'll start to see is this intersectionality of homelessness, because as we know, oftentimes homelessness is described if you do not have a permanent address. And so these traffickers will live with their victims in motel rooms, and they'll travel from city to city, motel room to motel room. So again, we also see this in the realm of homelessness as well. So here are some of the tactics that the offenders unfortunately will use. They will use sexual violence, physical violence, coercion, threats, intimidation, emotional abuse, isolation, minimizing, denying, and blaming. They're really good at gaslighting because they'll say, and here's the deal. What I'm about to tell you, this is what pimps will say to the girls, regardless of age. Because remember, we have adult victims of human trafficking, is that they'll say, you know, you were like this before I met you. So therefore, we're just making money off of what you already do. So in other words, making it seem like it's their idea, that gaslighting. Using their children is another example. Economic abuse. Whatever money that that person may make on the street, that money goes to the pimp, not to the person. And also, as I'm saying this, I want to also remind you that the victims can also be males, it can be adult men and boys as well. What we find statistically is that overwhelmingly the statistics show female. But what we have to remember that males can also be involved in this as victims, just like males can be victims of domestic violence as well. On the human trafficking side of it, and I'm sure you guys see this also on the domestic violence side, is that they don't self-report. And there's so many reasons for that. Societal reasons, they won't be believed, or there's just not resources out there for male and boy victims, adult male and boy victims of human trafficking. As far as I know right now, there's only one in the nation that will take boys in terms of residential. And then, of course, offenders are using that male privilege as well. So again, just as recapping this one slide, in both human trafficking and domestic violence, the offender's tactics are often one and the same. And so you will see that these tactics are presented in both. And so again, and I'll just give you an example. For instance, both traffickers and the abusive partners may intentionally even impregnate their victims. So you will have traffickers that will impregnate their victims in order to have them stay. Because unfortunately, the victims will fall in love with their traffickers, believing that this is a romantic partner. Because he's also going to be promising marriage as well as this forever intimate connection. And so we also will see that on the DV side as well, where sometimes they will impregnate their wives in order to control them and make sure they stay. So they use children control their victims' behavior. I've seen it where they've gone so far as to give, and I'm talking about the human trafficking end, well, they will give their victim a puppy. And they will tell them if they don't make X amount of money or if they don't do what they're told to do, they will then abuse that puppy. So they will even use that as control. They also will isolate their victims from everyone. So as you can see, we keep melting this unfortunate quilt. They'll control their finances. They'll threaten to expose their personal information. In other words, letting everybody know what it is they're doing. They will also use their sexuality or their immigration status to maintain control, power and control. And these tactics, again, you're starting to see the same. And what we also see, unfortunately, is the devastating effects that it has upon the HT and DV victims. And the unfortunate part is that what also follows the HT victim is that feeling of shame. The only difference is that it's coupled with that, again, that societal shame a prostitution. So sometimes you could have that HT victim in those domestic violence shelters, and they are not self-identifying. And we'll talk about that also in a minute. So other ways of control, again, are the threats of violence or the death to them of someone that they love. The physical, emotional, psychological abuse, threats of deportation, blackmail, financial control, and providing drugs for their victims as well. So as you can see, again, this quilt, this tragic quilt, just keeps on developing. Both the traffickers and domestic violence abusers often heavily monitor their survivor. So they, for the HT victim, they not only are monitoring their activity in that motel room or when they go to the store or wherever they're going. That's also why you will often see on the prostitution tracks, they're monitoring their activity as well. A survivor of human trafficking may not even see themselves as a victim because remember, they're gaslighting. And so it's just like the survivor of domestic violence. They may not see themselves as a victim as well because, you know, the idea of that emotional bonding of love, or that feeling like, okay, I made this decision and it's my fault. So to further demonstrate this, I put up the power and control wheels. And so as you could see to my left, what that looks like in terms of um, physical sexual violence, and you see it on the as it pertains to sex trafficking. And when you match the two up, again, that's where you start to see that they really match. So based on the Domestic Abuse Intervention Project's Duluth model, the power and control wheels outline the different types of abuse that occur in DV, labor trafficking, and sex trafficking situations, because unfortunately it's also interwoven as it pertains to labor trafficking as well. And so these tactics, again, are so similar in maintaining control. And these abusive relationships are the most dangerous and difficult bonds to break for the survivors of DV, sexual exploitation, as well as the human trafficking victim as well. So when you look at these, my God, I mean, it's so eerie how they, when the two are side by side, what this actually looks like. You look at things, you see emotional abuse, isolation in both, the denying, the blaming, the minimizing, the economic control. So the use of coercion and threats. So unfortunately, as you see these together, again, that quote, that quilt just keeps interlacing. So when we look at domestic homicides, the signs of potential domestic homicides are really not easy to detect, mainly because of how hidden the abuse is in the fear of worsening the situation. So just like in DV, the HT victims do not talk about their abuse. They don't even identify as victims of human trafficking, which all that does, of course, is empower the abuser. And again, this is especially true for other vulnerable women, especially when crimes are involved. So this perpetuates even further because let's think about it. This victim, because prostitution is against the law, this victim, unfortunately, is also involved in a crime, which also keeps her or him from reporting. According to the National Crime Scene Cleanup, about half, 46% of the victims murdered died at the hands of their intimate partner in the past decade. And intimate partner statistics show domestic violence makes up 15% of all violent crimes. So if we're only looking at this in terms of DV. If we add HT to it, can you imagine what that is going to do to those statistics? So again, this intersectionality of the hidden abuse, along with the crimes and homicides, are found in both types of victimization. And as a result, the homicide cause may not be accurate. So the homicide of an HT victim who is also a victim of domestic violence may not be counted in the DV stats, but just as a separate homicide. If they are killed, if the HT victim is killed by a sex buyer, although the sex buyer is a stranger, she would not, uh, uh, it, if one did not understand that the reason why she's out there in the first place is because of forced prostitution, they're just going to assume that this is a person in prostitution that was killed by a sex buyer, not understanding that the element of human trafficking played into it. And so therefore, I think that's one thing that we just need to be cognizant of. And of course, it's not going to be something that the coroner's office is going to talk about as it pertains to its cause of death. And even for law enforcement that is looking at this, they may just assume this is just someone that has died as a result of prostitution, with not entering into the fact that this could also be the possibility that the reason why she's out there is because she's forced out there. When we talk about statistics, so I only use statistical data just to kind of give us a ballpark figure of kind of what's going on out there. But as we know, statistical data really only becomes a statistic when someone is reporting it. So whether reporting in the system. So that system could be an arrest report. It could be a crime report. It could be because they are in other types of systems, such as when we talk about um, what am I trying to say? When we're talking about um, uh, whether the person is in has a social worker, right? So that's going to be in those types of systems. It's only until we're in those type of systems do we know the statistical information. But what about those that are flying under the radar that are not being counted? We don't know. So that's why we really don't have reliable statistical numbers of human trafficking cases, and of course, because they don't self-identify. But the National Human Trafficking Hotline reported 10,360 suspected cases in 2023. The lack of reliable statistical data is also a problem when attempting to identify the number of deaths caused by human sex trafficking related causes. What we also have to remember is that sometimes when someone calls the hotline, we don't often know if they really were a victim of human trafficking or not, unless it's reported back to the hotline center. So that again, that's why it really is not clear cut. And that's why we just need to really talk about it more, because it's when we talk about what are the glitches, it is only then that we start to fix the glitches. But what we do know is that according to Polaris, 40 to 45% of human sex trafficking victims were recruited by an intimate partner or family member, which can be an inherent factor of violence just in and of itself in some circumstances. And also, some reasons for the lack of statistical data is due to the lack of victims, again, self-identification, again, how the coroner is reporting the causes of death, and then law enforcement reporting practices as well. So although we know that DV and IPV and HT can result in death just due to the nature of the relationship, coupled with the intersectionality, we just really need to pay attention, just making sure that the data that we are reporting statistically is correct. So when we get the justice system involved, many human trafficking survivors of color are seen as criminals due to forced criminality. Oftentimes they could be arrested. And as I'm talking about this, I'm talking about this nationwide because there are some states and law enforcement agencies that really understand human trafficking, as well as I know you guys see this through the DV lens as well. There's some states that fully understand the DV victim and they act accordingly. Same thing with human trafficking. So oftentimes for the human trafficking victim, they are arrested for prostitution, drug use or sales, theft, forgery, robbery. Let me go back to this and just as a reminder of this. If one is a victim of human trafficking, regardless of age, they should not be arrested by law enforcement because they are a victim. Remember what I said earlier, that minors, just by age alone, if they are involved in prostitution, they should not be getting arrested. Minor victims should not be getting arrested for prostitution because of the fact that, again, they're minors, they're already considered victims. Again, some states and law enforcement have this right, and some are catching up. Also, what you will find with victims of human trafficking is that they will be forced maybe to rob their the sex buyers. So of course, if they rob the sex buyer, they're going to get arrested for robbery. Oftentimes, again, for theft. I've had both juveniles and adults say, you know, sometimes I will steal something in the store in the hopes that I'll get arrested so that I could just be away from him, even if it's just for a few nights. Now, remember when I talked about the fact that there are some spouses that will force their wives into prostitution. They too can be arrested for these things as well. And I didn't even understand that part when I was in law enforcement because for some reason I just could not fathom the fact that a husband would force his wife into prostitution. When I was doing direct services, I did start running into wives that were forced into prostitution, even those, and especially those that were brought into the country illegally, because they would hold that over their head. And that was their way of, unfortunately, bringing money into the household. So it's really important for us to keep survivors' experience with the justice system in mind when we're working with them. Many of these survivors of trafficking, again, are seen as criminals just in and of itself. So their victimization ends up taking a back seat. And so a lot of times these systems that they enter into, especially the justice system, and we're working on that, there is a paradigm shift. I go across the country teaching law enforcement how to have a more victim-centered approach when working with victims of human trafficking, because oftentimes these victims are not what? Trauma-informed. And so they sometimes will put victims at a greater risk of being exploited, hurt, or harmed. So it's really important that we, all of us, get involved in educating the system players about how traffickers use a victim's vulnerability in order to lure them into not only becoming victims, but also into, unfortunately, getting into the criminal justice system. So A 37-year exploratory study of prostitution homicides in 2019 really looked at this as well. And so the question becomes, who cares? So sometimes when there is a victim of homicide that also happens to be in prostitution, sometimes society as well as others don't really care. And I think that that is another reason why we don't, not us, but society doesn't really care about the rates. In fact, I don't know how many of you guys watch ID. I actually will watch ID or 48 hours from time to time. But when when they get that guy that is the serial killer, how many times do you often hear him say once he's caught is that he will purposely choose those on the prostitution side, or he will choose the prostituted because he knows that nobody really cares about her. She's so invisible to society. So it's this feeling that law enforcement doesn't care, society doesn't care. How often do you watch those shows and those victims that are also in prostitution also go unidentified? So the homicide rate for females in prostitution was 18 times higher than for females of the same age and race in general. Relative to others, they are victims that the public are more likely not to care about and may even harbor a sense of hatred against them. And we are going to see how that can also sometimes, unintended consequences, have a tendency to play itself out even in some of our shelters. They are often invisible and often dehumanized. So when we really put that in racial context, sometimes the marginalized are also seen as invisible and dehumanized. And when we take that a step further, when I said earlier about who are the victims of human trafficking, and oftentimes it is women of color, and more often than not, it is uh, uh, African American women and girls. So when we look at these obstacles, such as the lack of statistical data, racism, coupled with the dehumanization of those in prostitution, it does not put their deaths in the spotlight, nor does it motivate sometimes law enforcement in their efforts. I'm just going to give you an example, and this is not to put down law enforcement because I did 30 years, but this is also why I go across the nation and teach law enforcement how to have a more victim-centered approach. Um, just like we've had to do with DV, right? We've had to talk to law enforcement about how do we interview victims of DV. And God knows that, thank God, that has come a long way than what it was when I first came on the job in 1983 in terms of how we treated victims of domestic violence. But I'll give you an example as it pertains to rape. As a police officer, I was interviewing a person, an adult that I had arrested for prostitution, and she was telling me that she had gotten raped the night before. And I was like, oh, we need to do a rape report. And she was like, no, we don't really have to do a rape report. Nobody's going to do anything anyway. And she said, it's kind of like being a fireman. Sometimes you get burnt. That just hurt my heart. No, 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 and no. You should never be raped. You should never be raped as a spouse. A woman should never be raped as a spouse. And a woman should not be raped because she's in prostitution. And I had also would hear, unfortunately, some of my male law enforcement counterparts really believe that someone that was in prostitution could not be raped. They just would say that it was just a result of a bad business deal. Yeah, no, not so much. So let's look again at the intersectionality of trauma and the African American woman, because I think this is really important. oftentimes too, when we talk about human trafficking, um, we don't talk often enough about the fact of those high percentages of African American women, unfortunately, that are in human trafficking. And so when we talk about that intersectionality, I really like Dr. Gillum's approach to this. And what she says is that African American survivors of intimate partner violence have often experienced multiple forms of trauma, including but not limited to the intimate violence. Research indicates that African American women experience high rates of trauma and multiple forms of trauma, interpersonal, community, and systemic. The complex web of experiential trauma is associated with a host of significant mental and physical health consequences, social and economic consequences, and increased engagement in high-risk behavior of African American women. African American women help seeking efforts are hindered by a diverse set of circumstances. Consequently, many turn to informal sources of support. So let's unpack that for just a moment. Sometimes in terms of the African American woman, in terms of informal sources of support, that might be looking like telling their best friend, telling a pastor at a church, telling for victims of human trafficking, they may also tell someone who is also prostituted. But as I am reading this, I am again seeing that quilt being woven, because what we also find with victims of human trafficking, I saw a percentage as high as 80% of victims of human trafficking were molested as children. So therefore, again, seeing the woman's experience and the high rates of trauma. You see this in intimate partner violence. You also will see this in human trafficking as well. So the set of circumstances, again, are no different from the victim of human trafficking as it is for the IPV victim. Factors that compound IPV and HT for the African American woman also include racism, stereotypes of African Americans, and the myth of the Black community being inherently violent, dysfunctional, of course, poverty and disproportionate economic disadvantage. So as we unpack Dr. Gillum's statement here, we're starting to also see this thing unfold as it pertains to why is it, unfortunately, we need to pay attention to the African American victim. Oftentimes, I have even heard service providers believe that a white victim of human trafficking is sometimes seen as more of a victim than their Black counterparts. Also, law enforcement may view her the same way. If we are viewing this African American woman as being less of a victim, sometimes even unintentionally or implicit bias will step in where she may not get the same amount of services as her counterpart. So as a result of this, IPV and HT victim African American survivors have expressed dissatisfaction with domestic violence shelters, legal services, social services, when they are seeking services from the system that are not culturally competent. And again, we have talked about this, we meaning all of us, I'm sure, have had these conversations of why it's so important for these systems to be culturally competent. Many survivors don't seek the needed mental help, as well as just reaching out for help because they don't really feel that anyone is really going to help them. And because they don't seek the help, it just really leads them to the further risks of fatality. So the issue of African American women's experience of trauma is complex and concerning. Um, I'm going to stop right there because I think about law enforcement. Sometimes the African American community will not even reach out to law enforcement when they become a victim of any crime. But when they are a victim of intimate violence, or they're a human trafficking victim, they will not reach out to law enforcement or anybody in terms, or the other thing is mental illness, not wanting to reach out to law enforcement because they are afraid of the end result of a possible overuse of force, which may cause that person to be killed. We all know these stories of domestic violence calls, where I've gone to them and the victim will say, all I want you to do is make him stop. What they don't want to see is him being arrested, or him or her being arrested, or them being hurt. So oftentimes just not reaching out to law enforcement, and sometimes that becomes heightened even more so in the African American community. Even when you talk about mental health, and this is something again that the tide is starting to turn gradually, but we're in the African American community, we are constantly having these conversations that it's okay to reach out to get therapy. Doesn't mean that you're crazy to get therapy, right? So the issue of the African American woman's experience of trauma, that's what makes it so complex and concerning. And the toll that it takes on their families and the community is significant. And again, it can cause a risk factor for the escalation of abuse or fatalities. And all of these factors stand true in both types of victimization. And it only intensifies when one person is the victim of both, right? The HT victim is further dehumanized under the umbrella of shame, again, as a result of prostitution. So, what can DVFRTs do when reviewing deaths of IPV and HT? Check criminal records of the victim and the offender. And this is not to pass judgment, but you're only checking to see if there are any arrests related to forced criminality. Identifying any gaps in the system's involvement that may have prohibited the victim from seeking help, because this is how we learn, right? Making recommendations for continuing training of law enforcement, court staff, and other service providers. Who I want to add in this too is fire departments. Fire departments, because if you think about it, oftentimes the ambulance is the one that may show up first. So they also need to really understand what are some of the red flags to look for. Any other service providers who interact with victims to identify the intersections of DV and human trafficking. Review case facts in the context of culture to identify abuse in culturally specific ways, and identify any key informants, if possible, to gather details not available that you may not see in the system records. So, talking to friends and family and neighbors and co-workers also helps as well. So when we understand that we really need to train these stakeholders, it's similar to the training that we're doing right now. That education of this quilt that we are building through this presentation, and for them to understand how DV victims could be trafficked, that intersectionality is really going to help when screening out victims. Again, it's also important that the the service providers recognize that victims of domestic violence may also experience abuse in more culturally specific ways. Domestic violence fatality review teams, again, should take the time to understand the survivors' cultural backgrounds and the specific challenges that they face with domestic violence prior to their deaths. It's with this knowledge that the teams can better meet the needs of the victims of color and to be able to ensure their safety. Other ways, of course, is to establish collaborative relationships with human trafficking organizations or community-based organizations that interact with victims of trafficking. I'll tell you, when I was at Journey Out as the ED, we had to close our residential program for HT victims. So now, we had to either look for other residential places for HT victims, which there weren't a lot. And then, of course, we knew that there were DV shelters that were also housing HT victims. But I'll tell you, it wasn't until I was sitting at the table with the DV shelters and the two of us really got together and started identifying how this one person had so many multiple victimizations, and we really planned out what it was going to look like in terms of programming and resources, that I really fully understood the importance of that 360 view. So we must ensure that team membership is diverse in terms of race and expertise. And so this also is going to ensure the fairness and to make sure that we are inclusive in our decisions and our recommendations. Review cases of human trafficking in an unbiased manner and address possible biases from team members and perspectives. Because remember, team members, just as law enforcement, we all come into these jobs from the human race. And sometimes we bring our own biases. And sometimes we will see that victim of human trafficking as being one that is just a prostitute. And so sometimes there's biases that come with that. So we also need to be cognizant of our own biases. We must advise team members to thoroughly review and bring complete case files to the review process to lessen the likelihood of inadvertently overlooking trafficking indicators and make recommendations for system improvements as well. So again, experience and expertise of trained advocates is really important when we look at things like safety planning, making sure that if we're are placing a human trafficking victim, and let's say if her traffickers are gang related, that we're not just being careful what communities we're putting them in. And often, because remember, they don't always self-identify, which makes it even harder. But if they do self-identify, we need to be really clear what communities we're placing them in. And oftentimes they will tell you. So that's identifying levels of endangerment for the survivors and the advocates. Evaluating if the connection to family and community would be more helpful or is it going to be harmful? Applying harm reduction models, cross-system collaboration, knowledge of legal remedies that apply to traffic victims, understanding how trauma is linked to historical and cultural context, providing trauma-informed care, assessing in terms of what is going to be at risk in terms of lethal risk, screening for trafficking within the relationship in and of itself. And of course, we know it complicates things if they have children by the trafficker. So the HT victim, just like the DV victim, have a hard time leveraging or leaving their abusive partner. So, and I always use this when I'm trying to explain to people about the human trafficking victim, that it's going to take, and when I'm talking about explaining not only to the community, but also explaining it to us that are doing this every day. It's going to take 6 or 7 times, just like it does with a DV victim, for them to be able to leave their abusive partner. So therefore, we have to have patience. We have to have understanding. I know it's easy for me to say here with a PowerPoint, because when we're actually doing the work, whoo, man, I know I had to constantly remind myself of the patience and understanding part, because sometimes, just like being a police officer, I've probably been called everything but a child of God. So understanding is needed, coupled with the possibility. Now I know this is hard, especially not only in DV shelters, but even sometimes in AT residential programs, but that possibility in terms of having that option of them coming back if they leave. I know most of you probably did take a deep breath on that one. So as we're looking at this slide, here are some questions that we might think about when we're screening. So it's important that we screen domestic violence victims when we are working with them. And so again, we need to be careful that most may not disclose that they are being trafficked, or they may not be aware that they are being trafficked. And asking the right questions is really important in identifying the most that are impacted. So here are just some sample questions that we can give you, that kind of gives you an idea of whether or not this person is experiencing trafficking within their intimate relationship. So the questions of, do you ever feel pressured to do something that you don't want to do or feel uncomfortable doing? Has your intimate partner ever forced you to work or do certain tasks for money, food, or other necessities? Do you ever feel pressured to have sex with your partner? Have you been pressured or forced to have sex with people by your intimate partner? And what happens if you don't comply? Now, I know all of you know that even though I am putting these questions up here, I know that oftentimes many of you, and all of you probably, you guys know how to interview, and you know how to maybe incorporate these questions organically, right? Not go like, okay, question number 1, do you ever feel pressured? I know that you guys don't do that. So these are just, again, some ways to organically maybe ask these questions as you are doing the screening process. Here are some other ones. Again, it just being important that as we are screening domestic violence victims, and working with them to just be able to see where they are in this interwoven quilt that we have woven. So do you have access to any money that you earn? Does your intimate partner take money again that you have earned? Are you required to make a certain amount of money? Oftentimes, human trafficking victims are required to make X amount of money on a nightly basis. If they do not do that, they are beaten and abused. Does your intimate partner supervise your communication, actions, or movement? Does your intimate partner control your legal documents, identification, passports, etc.? And are you able to access medical care? And so this is me, this is my card, this is my phone number. If you have any further questions other than what we are going to uh, entertain today, please reach out to me. I look forward to hearing from you. And at this point, Letitia, I'm going to start sharing my screen. Is that okay?
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. And Dr. Paul, if you don't mind, since we do have some spare time, there were a
Okay.
couple questions in
Okay.
the chat. And we did adjust the settings to where participants can unmute yourselves and ask questions if you have any as well. But one of the first ones I've seen, do you have statistical information or some research insight into how the foster care system is used in terms of traffickers making foster care kids victims?
Oh my goodness. So I don't, so let me tell you, I don't have the statistics, but what I can tell you is that the risk factors are extremely high. One of the risk factors for human trafficking victims is the fact that they're foster children or that they're in the foster system. The reason why I said, oh my God, you know, when you guys know, when you're doing this work, I kid you not, the elements of evil are everywhere, right? Like I can't even imagine being a foster child where I go into a foster home where they're supposed to protect me and I might be being abused by the foster parents. But how about this? Being sold by the foster parents. It does happen. I've had victims come to me that say, when I was in the foster system, I was being sold by my foster parents. So trust me, unfortunately it happens. And and just think about the vulnerability piece, just inherently alone being a foster child, right? Sometimes the support isn't there. Sometimes we're very upset because why does that foster child keep running? When you start digging into why that foster child keeps running, we may not only see abuse, but what we might also see is that they're being sold. So I'm sorry, I don't have the statistics, but what I can tell you is that it is happening more often than not. And let me add this in terms of this cross-sectionality as it pertains to youth. I got a phone call one day from a social worker who was trying to get services for a 7-year-old that was being pimped out by her father. This child was so sexualized that they were having problems placing her in foster care because if there was a man in the house, she would try and seduce the males in the house. So it does become very complex. So I smiled when this question happened, not because of the joy that it brings me for the victimization, but it gave me this opportunity to highlight another added problem another complex problem when it comes to this HT victim, also as it pertains to the foster system.
Absolutely. And we have another question in regards to addressing LGBTQ community and the impact by human trafficking and domestic violence. Would you like to respond?
Absolutely. Again, you'll see the same reasons for the intersectionality of the cross pollination. But what I would say about unfortunately for LGBTQ victims, they're a huge risk factor as well, because sometimes what happens is when they come out to the family, if the family is not receptive to the fact that they've come out, or they don't understand, or there's a lot of friction, what happens for the minor? They get kicked out of the house. Once they get kicked out of the house, unfortunately, that puts them out there on the street. And what also happens to them is that they might do survivor sex. And if they're doing survivor sex just to survive and to get money, guess who's out there? That predator, the pimp, who then start to pimp them out because he or she's going to say, I will be able to protect you. And therefore, and since you're out here doing this anyway, let's go ahead and make that money. So there is a huge vulnerability for that community. as it pertains to the risk factor, not only for human trafficking, but for domestic violence. Remember, I think there was that one slide where it showed that traffickers will use that person's sexuality as a weapon for that. Okay, I'm gonna hold your secret, but if you don't do what I'm telling you to do, your secret is going to be out to everyone. So that's how it's used, unfortunately.
Yes. And we also have a hand raised, James Maddox. If you would like to unmute yourself.
Terrific. Thank you very much. Yes, my name is James Maddox. I am a social worker in Pasadena, California. Uh, and my question is about the monies that police agencies get or law enforcement agencies get for certain crimes. They get money back from, I guess, the DOJ for drugs and weapons, but there is no commensurate remuneration or reciprocal remuneration for human trafficking. And I haven't been a social worker long, so I will revert back to my business uh, language lexicon. They don't care. They just don't care. Um, and if there's no money in it, if I can't get a benefit, I guess the program is what you would probably know better than I. It's a 330 program or something where police agencies get reimbursed for certain crimes that they prosecute.
So that, James, that's interesting. Welcome to the community of social work.
Thank you very
Uh,
much.
we don't get paid a whole lot like you would in business, but but honestly, we're impacting lives, and sometimes that in of itself that may not pay the bills, but I'll tell you, it makes you feel good. So welcome to the community, James. What I will tell you is that oftentimes when law enforcement gets money, it will go to deployment. So in other words, let's say a vice unit, I'm just using that as an example. It may help to, let's say if the vice unit has only 3 people, deployment is when you're putting in 4 and 5 people into that unit. So it's deploying them into that particular unit. So sometimes you'll see money go toward deployment, putting more officers, throwing more officers to the situation. This is what has been recently happening in grants. There are federal grants out there for law enforcement to pair with nonprofit organizations that specifically deal with human trafficking. So, for instance, you're in Pasadena. I'm in the LA area. So, for instance, there was a grant that Saving Innocence had with the LA Sheriff's Department. So if they, and that grant just recently changed in terms of who are the recipients that are working alongside law enforcement right now. And I don't want to give any names because I don't want to mess it up, but I'll just go with what I did know. So Saving Innocence was a nonprofit organization that specifically dealt with minors of minor victims of human trafficking. So if law enforcement did a sting and they found minor victims of human trafficking, their protocol was to not only call DCFS, not only DCFS would get called, but Saving Innocence would get called as well. So it became an effort in that way. So what I'm describing to you is what we're doing here. But that same grant was a federal grant. So if law and law enforcement and the nonprofit organization had to put in for that grant together. And so I'm glad you brought that up because if I'm not mistaken, that grant is up right now. And I think the deadline is either May 15th or the 30th. So that was money that where in terms of law enforcement had to have a dedicated human trafficking unit in order to even apply for this specific grant. So we're making progress, but you're absolutely right. Wouldn't it be great if you didn't have to go through all jumping through all those hoops? Because I don't know about you guys as I take my glasses off, but I'm telling you right now, whoo, applying for federal grants, Lord have mercy. You have to be a PhD in that alone. And I was only smart enough to get one PhD, and trust me, it had nothing to do with grants. I looked at those grants, that's why I had to employ a grant. Not only trying to get the grant and writing it, but trying to maintain it and reporting it. The money, you need the money, so you got to do it. But I'm telling you, if you guys could research this grant that I'm talking about, and if you have a relationship with your law enforcement agency, and if you could get them along with you to apply for this particular grant, it's a good grant to get, because also what comes with it is what? Training, which also is cultural competency, and also how to deal with victims as well. So I'm sorry I was long-winded with that, but I love those two questions because it's just important that people understand.
Yes. I know someone asked for you to repeat the name of the grant.
I don't know the exact name of the grant, but if you email me, I can get that to you. But it is a federal grant that is that deals with human trafficking, and it's for law enforcement and nonprofit organizations that deal with human trafficking victimization.
Okay. And we have two other questions. Someone asked if you have a podcast or ongoing opportunities to stay connected to relevant information for advocates of and executive directors of human trafficking organizations.
You know, I am loving these people. Listen, Letitia, you would have thought that I was paying them for them to ask these questions. Listen, I have really been thinking about doing a podcast. Now you have really uh uh piqued my interest in doing it. And because I really do want to do a podcast. And oh my God, when you talk about executive directors of nonprofit organizations, because I did it for 7 years. Listen, more times than not, what are we doing? We are in the trenches doing the work. We are doing the work. We are not even paying attention politically of what laws are coming into effect that could impact, and I'm talking to the HT folks right now, that could impact the work that we do, greatly impact the work that we do. So listen, next month I'm gonna have one done because I'm already working on my website. I love talking to folks about the things that I have learned because I see this thing from a law enforcement lens, and I see it from the advocate lens as well. And seeing it in both ways, and then seeing it in the terms of cultural competency. There's so much for us to talk about, and we don't have time often, more often than not, to sit and even on a webinar because we're doing the work. So stay tuned. When I get my website for my podcast together, my expert here, Letitia, will hopefully be able to put it out to you guys so she has everybody's email.
Yes.
Thank
And I
you
could
for the
also
encouragement.
yeah, and I could also share the list of participants with you as well.
That would be great.
Okay, what other questions we have? I'm trying to ensure that I did not miss anyone, so please feel free to unmute yourselves if you have a burning question. Oh, and I see some links in here for funding opportunities as well. So
That's what I'm talking about. Get those links for funding opportunities. That's what we need.
yes.
You know, I just also, before we even have a chance to close, to you guys, I just want to say to you, thank you. Thank you for the work that you're doing. Oftentimes you don't get thanked. I thank you for the work that you're doing, for the service that you're doing, because if not, then if not you, then who? Honestly, please, please, please. I know this work gets taxing. This work gets hard. This work gets stressful. But your clients, they need you. The more you learn and the more we learn how to serve them, the better work we can do, and hopefully the better that they can be to get out of these failed systems that all of us are working within. I know I'm speaking to the choir on that one. You know, at the end of the day, we want all of our clients to be self-sufficient, for us not even to be their caseworker, for them not to even be in these systems, so that they can lead their lives the way that they want to, and that we can provide the services that they need to be self-sufficient at the end of the day. That's what all of us want. So please, I encourage you.
And we
I
do
think
have,
there's a raised hand.
yes, Miss, awesome.
Hello, this is very interesting. I am very enjoying this. I'm actually driving. Hope I don't get fired because I ain't gonna be on my phone. But I did put in the chat. Would you say that most of the women that help to aid to see the victims are victims themselves, or percentage of maybe of how many of the women are victims, or are they doing it just because?
Oh my goodness. So let me tell you what I've noticed is, I had to laugh about you being on your phone, because I would have been doing the same thing. But what I have noticed is a couple of things. Is that, well, here's an interesting point. So you talk about the traffickers, right? What we have found is that oftentimes, especially when we're talking about poverty, let's say somebody's living in the projects, the abuser and the victim at one point are on even scales, right? The abuser may have been a victim of sexual abuse, of abuse, poverty, blah blah. They're on the same scale. As they get older, one becomes the abused and the other becomes the abuser. That's one thing. What we're also seeing is that sometimes you'll have an adult victim of human trafficking who started at age 12, who is now 23, but because of the obstacles that have gotten in the way, such as a law enforcement record, not having a high school diploma, those obstacles have caused her to now work the streets. What you'll also find, unfortunately, is that, again, when I talked about the victim who now becomes the abuser, sometimes you will see some victims of human trafficking who now are recruiting for their trafficker. So this is where it gets really sticky, because that person that I just defined might end up being the person that is placed in your shelter that is now recruiting other women out of a domestic violence shelter or HT shelter to join her pimp or trafficker. So I'm not saying that happens all the time, but these are just some things that we might look out for as well. So statistically, I don't know what the statistics are. I would hope that they would not be that they're not that high, but know that those conditions exist. You know, how often do we have a parent who abuses their child who also becomes the abuser? Same concept.
Yes, awesome. I know, and thank you all for interacting and providing feedback for Dr. Powell in the chat. Uh, awesome. And I think I have all the questions. So do you have anything in closing, Dr. Powell, that you would like to?
No, I don't have anything else. I just, man, it's just been a pleasure. I know I haven't had a chance. I only see your names in squares, but it's just what I feel in terms of the energy. I'm just so happy to meet each and every one of you. It's been an honor to serve, and thank you so much, Letitia, for giving me this opportunity to share. And please reach out to me and listen. Look for my podcast now that I'm gonna put that together.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Paul, for this very engaging and informative presentation. We all enjoyed it. And thank you, of course, for being a part of our steering committee for our Ensuring Culturally Specific Responses Domestic Violence Fatality Review Teams project. I will be sharing office hours and other events and notices about our project with participants as well. So we'll be in touch, sending you everything that we promised during today's webinar.
And
So,
Miss Brooks, be careful driving.
Well, thank you, thank you, thank you.
yes, thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.